Chu. He's a senior research associate here at the Center for Transportation Research. He's been with us for a long time now, almost 20 years, since 1993. He's got his BS in mathematics from Hangzhou University in China and his PhD in economics from Irvine. Dr. Chu's widely published and also very active, served on a number of editorial boards and publication and report review for a real host of venues. Strong expertise in working with data, and I think perhaps most important to today's topic, he's worked with the National Household Travel Survey for a number of years on numerous projects, is very familiar with both the current and previous travel surveys, and has widely published and advised FHWA on survey issues as well. So it's a real neat opportunity to have his expertise on that subject with us today. Go ahead, Dr. Chu.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Let's start. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm clicking the wrong button. Okay. A brief outline. First, briefly, we can look at the source of information for this presentation, and then motivation and objectives, both the study objectives and this presentation. Then we are going to spend a few minutes on the data used and the basic methodology in using the data to assess transit markets. Finally, we are going to look at the results, mostly highlighting some of the results from the study because the report contains a vast amount of information, and we are limited to what we can present for this presentation. And a little bit conclusions, and lastly for questions and answers. Well, the material presented today is based on a report, an assessment by the same title, essentially. It's a report of the National Center for Transit Research, a house that's CUTR, and was funded by the Florida Department of Transportation. Diane Quigley of FDOT was the project manager, and myself was the PI. And the full report is available at the NHTS website with the link listed there. Well, motivation. Let me start with the APTA's 2007 report, a profile of public transportation passenger demographics and trip characteristics reported in onboard surveys. Some of you might be familiar with that. Just here are a few highlights of that report. It was based on tabulated data from 150 onboard surveys, and the data were collected by individual transit agencies during a 6-year period from 2000 to 2005. And APTA used that tabulated data from those agencies and defined several transit markets for each of 15 demographic and trip characteristics. For example, trip purpose was one of those 15 variables used. And the data from individual agencies were then weighted by system-wide annual ridership to get national totals. And from that analysis, the study determined market size, basically the distribution of transit riders across the markets for each characteristic used. For example, one of the results from this report is that 59.2% of the riders were on their way to work, and this number has been widely cited and used. trouble finding the button. Where's my mouse?
You want me to advance it for you, Sheha?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Well, the results from this 207 profile report are now part of APTA's annual public transportation fact book, and again, I mentioned they are widely cited by transit and government reports and in speeches of government officials. And they are also used as important parameters in transportation studies, including the widely known moving cooler report. But there are a couple of concerns as a motivation for the current study. One is that the data, while coming from individual onboard surveys, which are based on some statistical design, but they are not uniform, and in total, they are not based on a statistical rigorous process. Secondly, the results are limited to information on the size of individual transit markets without telling, the characteristics of those markets. Thank you. So here comes this study. We want to assess transit markets from several perspectives, not just the market size, but also the characteristics of those markets in terms of modal share, not just in transit, but also other modes, the attitudes of the trip makers, and the socio-demographic variable attributes of transit markets, as well as the trip characteristics of the transit trips in those transit markets. Secondly, we want to use data that are based on a uniform and a statistically rigorous process, so that hopefully results are far more reliable. And thirdly, we want to present descriptive information about these markets rather than causal relationships. Thank you. In terms of the presentation, three basic elements. One is to introduce some basic information about the data, which is the 2009 NHTS data, National Household Travel Survey. And then we want to show how the data were used in defining and assessing transit markets. And finally, which is the focus, of course, is to highlight some of the results from the assessment, looking at all 5 aspects. Well, let's start with the data. Again, it's the 2009 National Household Travel Survey data. The survey had over 150,000 households nationwide, and about 16,000 for Florida. And each sample household was given a travel day throughout the year in a random way. So, the results represent a whole year, not just a day or a period. And the data, travel data were collected through telephone interviews based on the pre-mailed diaries. And travel data were collected for all persons 5 years of age or older. And then the travel data cover all modes, all purposes, all trip lengths, in all areas of the country, urban and rural. And the survey came up with weights, statistically based weights, to expand the sample to national totals annually. And it's important to emphasize the unit of travel data from the NHTS surveys and to understand what we are talking about. The travel data were collected for individual person trips made by sample households on their travel day. And a person trip is defined as any time a person went from one address to another for purposes other than changing a mode. So if somebody is transferring, being dropped off and get on a bus, that's not a person trip. it's from one address to another for doing something other than the changing of mode. And also, a person trip essentially is a one-way trip from its origin to its destination. Stated differently, particularly for transit, a person trip is a link trip, not a boarding or on-link trip. Rather, it's a link trip. Steve? This is just briefly list the relevant data content from the survey used in this study. Of course, the whole survey has far more data content than what we used. Here, the data we used are grouped into several categories. Household and locational characteristics include income, vehicle availability, racial, ethnicity, housing density, and urbanized area status. Personal characteristics include age, driver status, immigration status, medical conditions. These medical conditions are those that would make someone difficult to travel outside the home. And there are also personal habits and attitudes. One of the habitual variables we use is the monthly frequency of transit use during the whole month immediately before the travel day for each household. And then the attitudes, the respondents stated toward certain transportation issues, which we will detail a little bit later. And then also there are several general trip characteristics we used. Day of week, start time in terms of time of day, trip distance, duration, trip purpose, and then the main mode. Since we are talking about link trips, the main mode is the mode that used for most of the distance. Now, in terms of transit, we defined the transit for this study to include local public bus, commuter train, subway or elevated train, and streetcar or trolley. Now, these are listed in the survey without specific definitions, and it's up to the respondents to understand what they mean. And so transit trips in this study mean person trips whose main mode is one of these transit modes. So know that all these are traditionally fixed route modes. Transit in this study does not include like a van pool or dial ride services. One reason is that they are not well defined in the survey. And in addition to the general trip characteristics we mentioned previously, the survey also have transit-specific trip characteristics, including waiting time, up to 5 access modes, up to 5 egress modes, and as well as total access time and the total egress time. Okay, now it's important to look at the data quality for people to determine, the results and their reliability. Here, of course, since this is a survey data, and they would involve both non-sampling errors and sampling errors. Of course, it's not possible to estimate the magnitude of non-sampling errors, but because the NHTS data are based on a regular statistical procedure, we can estimate the magnitude of sampling errors. Here we have done that for a few population segments, including the U.S. total sample and the U.S. zero vehicle households, U.S. non-drivers, and then a further disaggregated group, non-drivers in zero vehicle households, and finally the Florida total sample. What we have here are 5 columns of data. The first 2 columns show the sampled transit trips within each of these segments, and then the estimated annual transit trips once these sampled transit trips were weighted for each of these population segments. Now we have shown 3 measures of sampling errors. The first one is marginal error, 90% confidence margin errors. In general, margin error is going to be bigger when the estimate is bigger. Similarly, we have standard error, and they follow similar magnitudes of larger sample errors for larger estimates in general. As a result, it's hard to compare, the relative reliability of these estimates. So people often use a normalized measure of standard error, which is a coefficient of variation. Measures the ratio of the standard error over the estimate. Here you can see that for the U.S. as a whole, the annual total transit trip estimate has 3.3% standard error. If you look at more disaggregated segment, which are the U.S. non-drivers in zero vehicle households, the coefficient of variation is 16.5%, which is not small. The larger the coefficient of variation, the worse. So you want smaller coefficient variation numbers. And now the reports, neither the reports or the presentation will not show the standard errors or coefficient of variation for any of the numbers presented. One reason is that we just don't have space to present those, and the table we just shown is to help the reader to get some sense what kind of magnitudes of errors we may get for the results. Okay. Here, more coming to the methodology part of the study. We have identified 8 characteristics to define transit markets. 3 are personal characteristics, 3 are households, and 2 are travel-related characteristics. Just to most self-explanatory, in terms of driver status, we separate the age and then whether or not somebody is a driver. And in terms of medical conditions, I mentioned already, just one thing I want to emphasize is vehicle availability. We define vehicle availability in a relative sense, comparing the number of vehicles available in a household relative to the number of workers in the household. So showing not just whether or not somebody as a household has any vehicle, but also the adequacy of vehicle availability in a household if they have vehicles. Steve? Here, using the 8 characteristics we just mentioned, and to define the specific markets by showing the criteria used for each of these characteristics. For example, here on non-drivers, are non-drivers who are at least 15 years of age. Do not include the children. And then new immigrants, to increase the number of sample, basically the sample size for each of these segments. We increase the number of years, for new immigrants, because traditionally people think that new immigrants, they merge into society quickly in a few years. But if we do that, we just don't have enough people in the group. So we use 10 years to define new immigrants. And then another thing we want to, most of these are self-explanatory, but in terms of frequency of usage markets, we have defined mostly 4 markets that we emphasize the first 3. For those who use transit at least 30 times a month, we call those the most frequent users. And then the next group use transit 10 to 29 times a month. These are medium frequency users. And then lastly, the least frequent users use transit 1 to 9 times a month. And then we defined 3 groups for trip purpose: work-related, school, and medical and dental. Now we should have probably added shopping, but we didn't do that, so we can't present anything on that. And in addition to those characteristics used for defining markets, one of the perspectives of an assessment is to look at the socio-demographic characteristics of individual markets. To do that, we have used those same characteristics used for defining those markets, but in addition, we have added a person age as one of those variables to look at the characteristics of those markets. We use 3 categories: under 18, 18 through 64, and the 65 plus, which are the older adults. And then we also added 2 locational variables to look at the characteristics of markets. One is housing density, in terms of how many housing units per square miles, and then the status and the size of urbanized areas. In 4 categories. Now, one thing I should mention that these density and urbanized area variables were appended to the NHTS data. The appended data were based on Census 2000 data because the newer data were not available yet. So, that information is somewhat dated, but in general, patterns will still be valid probably for 2009. Thank you. And finally, we are going to look at the triple characteristics of individual markets, and these are the variables we use, including 5 transit-specific characteristics we mentioned already in data content, and then 6 general triple characteristics to assess the transit market. Finally, in this section about data and methodology, I want to emphasize, a few 2 matters related to the interpretation of the results. We kind of mentioned already, but just to emphasize, the results presented as descriptive information, basically trying to say how different the markets are, rather than trying to say why, the markets are different. Just to illustrate, suppose, well, actually these are real numbers. The transit modal share is 6.9% for persons with income under 15,000, versus 1.2% for persons from households with at least 100,000 income. So we are just going to say, okay, this is the difference between these 2 groups, not saying why. Of course, income will be one of those factors to explain, but there are many other factors. We do not try to come up with those other factors. Secondly, it's important to emphasize that the results presented represent characteristics of trip makers, or essential trips, associated with characteristics of the persons who are making the trips. So the characteristics are not personal characteristics, but the characteristics of the trips, which is very similar to what you will see in tabulated data from onboard surveys, like the 2007 APTA's profile report. They show characteristics of riders, not the persons. Essentially, what that means is that persons who make 4 times as many trips would have 4 times as much influence on the results. And just keep it in that mind when you see the results. Thank you. Okay, now let's move on to the first set of results. This is related to market size. What we are trying to show is the distribution of well, not distribution, transit share of, what this shows is that for 9 key markets, we want to see what percent of transit trips are made by people in each of these markets. We have 9 listed here. The study looked at far more than that, as we saw earlier in the table. For space purposes, we just emphasize 9 key markets here to highlight. Now, the green bars show the market size for each of these segments, and the yellow bars show the share of population captured by each of these markets. Now, let's look at the green bars first. For example, for work purposes, the number is 36.3%. What means is that among all transit trips, 36.3% are made for work purposes. Now, some of you may recall that a similar number from the APTA profile report was 59.2%. There are, many reasons for the differences, but we don't have space to time to get into that. We will see more results on work trips share of total transit market later. Now, the most significant market certainly is zero vehicle households. They capture almost half of the transit market. Secondly, the most frequent users are also very significant. Now, if you look at the other end of the range, non-drivers, they are about 12.2%, 4%. New immigrants, 8.2% of the overall transit market. Now, another thing I want you to see from this is the difference between each segment's share of transit trips versus its share of the population. And the difference or the ratio between these two shares indicates how much more a particular transit market uses transit. Next, we want to look at the general mobility levels of each of these key markets we are highlighting. What this shows is the number of person trips made by all modes relative to the average person in the total population. So, for example, if we look at the most frequent users, the ratio is 1.07. What that means is that when look at the travel by all modes, most frequent users actually travel more than the average person. And why this is relevant? This is relevant because even if a particular population segment relies on transit is significant, but if the overall travel mobility level is low, then the total ridership contribution from that particular market is lower because of that. So, for example, if you look at the non-drivers, they travel about 1/2 as much as the average person in the total population. Similarly, zero vehicle households and people with medical conditions, they travel significantly less than the average person. On the other hand, blacks, Hispanics, and the new immigrants, they travel still less than the average person, but close to what the average person travels. Steve? Okay, modal shares. This shows the transit modal share for each of these key markets. And we have indicated the transit modal share overall for the whole nation for all transit groups. It's 1.92% overall. But for these individual groups, certainly the most frequent users, which may be expected, and then zero vehicle households are highly reliant on transit. For the most frequent users, they use transit for over 1/3 of their daily travel. And for zero vehicle households, they rely on transit for more than 1/4 of their overall travel. For all the other key markets we are looking at here, their reliance on transit is significantly less than 10% of all their daily travel. Particularly if you look at non-drivers, less than 5%. Even for households with income under 15,000, their reliance on transit is just about 7%. And it's important to understand how each market is relying on transit, but also how they are traveling by other means as well. Here, let's see, we are looking at, in addition to transit, we are looking at driving a household vehicle, riding a household vehicle as a passenger, and walking, biking, and then the rest of the group, other modes in other. Now the transit is indicated by green, the green color. Driving is in blue, riding is red, walking is purple, and biking is yellow. There are several things stand out. One is that if you look at the zero vehicle households, they still rely on POV, driving or riding, for 10%, about 10% of their travel. On the other hand, for non-drivers, of course, they don't drive, but they rely on riding as a passenger in the POV for half of their travel. Steve, can you go back a little bit more? Another thing to see that is walking is very significant for all these markets, particularly for zero vehicle households and the most frequent users. But one thing that struck me a lot when I saw this first was how little bike is used by any of these groups, particularly by zero vehicle households. They walk for 40% of their travel, but very little by biking. So, Steve? Okay, now we move to the second set of results related to attitudes. The survey asked two questions on attitudes at for the national sample. The add-on samples had more attitude questions. One of the two questions asked was to ask the respondents to indicate the most important issue to them among a list of 6 pre-specified issues. Safety concerns, which means being involved in an accident. Aggressive distracted drivers, the price of travel, including in the transit fare, in the tolls, and the gas price. Highway congestion, lack of pedestrian facilities, and then access to and availability of transit service. Now here what we have shown is the distribution of the transit trip makers across these 6 issues for transit as well as each of the other major modes. Here I want to emphasize that the issue of access to and transit availability is far more important to transit trip makers as one would expect than any of the other modes. And if you notice that the highway congestion is not on one of the most important issues, rather the price of travel is far more important than any other issue. Steve? Here we are looking at attitudes across the 9 key transit markets. And in general, the general pattern still is the same across these different markets. Remember, we are looking at the transit trip makers. So these are the attitudes of the transit trip makers. And you notice that same is true, congestion, highway congestion or lack of pedestrians facilities are not as important to as many people as some of the other issues. And in terms of access and availability of transit, it's important to find more people among most frequent users, for example, and zero vehicle households than, for example, Hispanics. And price of travel is far more important for non-drivers and the blacks. Steve? Well, now this is kind of looks messy. I'll explain a little bit more for this first slide. So this is the first slide that we're going to look at the social demographic characteristics of transit markets. And this slide is for the market of non-drivers. First, let's look at the green bars first. The green bars show the distribution of transit trips made by non-drivers across the individual markets defined for each characteristics we mentioned earlier. For example, if you look at the top four green bars, okay, those are related to the markets defined on the basis of urbanized areas. And similarly, if you look at the bottom, three green bars, they are defined based on the three markets based on person age. Okay, and so the green bars relate to the trips made by non-drivers. Now the yellow bars show the distribution of all transit trips across the same social demographic segments. Okay. There's a lot of information here, but I just want to emphasize a few segments I indicated with horizontal arrow on the left. For these segments, you notice that the green bar is much higher, longer than the yellow bar. Take, for example, Hispanics in the middle. Okay, I guess I can use my pointer. Hispanics, the green bar here. Basically, what this says is that among all the transit trips made by non-drivers, half of them were made by Hispanics. So, that's very significant. In comparison, when you look at the total transit market, Hispanics, make a far smaller share of overall, transit trips, about 30% actually. So what this means that among the trips made by non-drivers, there's a high concentration of Hispanics. Similarly, if you look at low-income segments. So, this particular transit market of non-drivers, there's a high concentration of low-income trip makers, as well as low-frequency users. If you look at here, the least frequent users use transit 1 to under 10 times a month. They represent 25%, 1/4 of the trips made by non-drivers. But about a little bit, 13% of all transit trips. So the trips made by non-drivers has a much higher concentration of least frequent users. Okay, and this shows the social demographics of new immigrants. Again, we are just going to be focusing on a few segments indicated with the arrows. As one would expect, non-immigrants are going to be highly concentrated by Hispanics, as you will see here. The green bar is almost twice as long as the yellow bar here, indicating high concentration of Hispanics, of course, as one would expect. But in addition, if you look at here, non-drivers, the trips made by new immigrants, over 1/4 of those are also by non-drivers. But if you look at the total transit market, it's probably like 13% are made by non-drivers. So the concentration of non-drivers is much higher among new immigrants than the overall market. And then there are a few other markets, low income, and then also, for example, vehicle availability among those households that have fewer vehicles than workers. They are also highly concentrated, more concentrated in this market. Next, please. This shows the results for persons with medical conditions, those conditions that will make it difficult for them to travel outside the home. Now, there are quite a few arrows, but let me look at the first zero vehicle. Among the trips made by these people with medical conditions, 76% are, made by people from zero vehicle households. So that's a very high concentration. Of course, you compare to the yellow bar, which is I can't tell how large, but about 50%. Versus 76%. That's a significant concentration of zero vehicle household in people with medical conditions. Another one is low income, people with income under 15,000. Almost 60% of the trips by people with medical conditions are under 15,000 income. But their share of the total transit market is less than half of that in the yellow bar here. Income. Okay. This shows the social demographics of the market with income under 15,000. Several markets stand out. One of those is Hispanic Black. So low-income transit market has a high concentration of blacks. That's one. Another segment that has a high concentration is persons with medical conditions. 22.2% of trips made by the low-income group are people with medical conditions, versus about half of that for the total market. Steve? Zero vehicle households. Now, some of them, let's see. One of the things that are noticeable, which we have not seen before, is that the trips made by zero vehicle households have a high concentration of people from the high density areas, 4+ housing units per square mile. The green bar is much higher than the yellow bar. And alternatively, we have low income, of course, one would expect. And also people with medical conditions. Hispanics. Let's see. One thing noticeably different here is that the trips made by Hispanics has a high concentration of the middle income group or middle low income group. Households with income between 15,000 to 50,000. It's interesting. And also another segment that's highly represented among Hispanic trip makers is older immigrants. Okay, older immigrants, well, as well as new immigrants. So both immigrants, and which are expected. And non-Hispanic blacks. Many of these are highly expected, and if you look at Hispanics, we look at zero vehicle households, which have a high concentration here among black trip makers, as well as low income. And one would expect that non-immigrants are highly concentrated because most immigrants are not black nowadays. most frequent users. This is very different from the previous markets we have been looking at. This is based on frequency, not transportation disadvantages. And as a result, you will see that the segments that are highly concentrated here are quite different. One of those is high housing density, which showed up once. And then another one is whites. Non-Hispanic whites have a higher concentration among the most frequent users than the general transit market. And also among households with fewer vehicles than workers. There's a high concentration among the Steve, you moved on already. Okay.
Yeah, I got one ahead of you. Sorry.
So this is the last market we are looking at in terms of socio-demographics. And again, this is also based on trip purpose, not transportation disadvantages. And here you will see quite different patterns. One of the segments that have a relative concentration in work trip purposes are the more frequent users of transit. Okay. And then the whites, most high income group, which never showed up before. And then we also older immigrants and the drivers and the non-children or older group. The middle-age population has a concern. Well, because we're talking work purposes, of course, but this is very different pattern than the others. Okay, now we move on to trip characteristics. That's the last set of results. Oh, we are almost running out of time. I need to just highlight a few here. The first one we're going to look at is the percent of transit trips for work purposes. We mentioned a little bit at the beginning, which also repeated here, indicated by the number in purple, 36.3% for the entire transit market for the nation. But the rest of the bars shows the percentage of transit trips for work purposes for each of the transit markets we looked at in this study. And they vary widely. Among the highest, among the income, household with highest income, with at least 100,000 annual income, their transit, 55.6% of the transit trips are for work purposes. And the other group has a very high percentage of transit trips for work purposes. Those households that have fewer vehicles than workers, 57.1%. And to the lower end of the spectrum are non-drivers. Less than 10% of their transit trips are for work purposes. And also among the least frequent users, just over 12% of their trips are for work purposes. But I don't know if I should move further. Let me just look at the income. Steve, can you move to the slides by income groups? Okay. Here we are looking at some differences in wait time distributions across the markets defined based on household income. And the first one is wait time. And you will notice that among the lower income markets, a much higher proportion of their transit trips involve longer waiting. Okay, so that's kind of indicating that lower income markets experience a poorer service, at least in terms of waiting time. Next. In terms of speed, a similar picture shows up. The lower income markets experience low overall speeds than the high income markets. Now, just to emphasize, the speeds here, we are talking about door-to-door speeds, not just the in-vehicle speeds, but also access and egress involved. Next. One reason I explain the differences, in wait time and the speeds may be at the trip distances of the trips made by different income groups. In general, the lower income markets tend to use transit more for shorter trips. Or another way, higher share of the transit trips by lower income markets are shorter trips than the higher income markets. Next. And in a similar way, a much higher portion of the transit trips by the lower income markets occur during midday, where the service is, poorer, lower frequency, for example, than in peak times. And lastly, we just kind of look at the access mode and egress mode. There's some systematic differences in how much walking and the transit is used for access. Lower income households are more likely to walk to their main mode, but less likely to use transit or POV vehicles for access. And, in general, the pattern is similar for egress modes. One difference is that transit is used more for access, egress than access. But the POV is used less for egress than access, as one would expect. Okay, so we present a lot of data, and it's hard to kind of conclude based on data. We're just going to say that the 209 NHTS provides a rich and statistically more reliable data for assessing transit markets, or as well as for many other purposes. And the results help us understand not only the significance of each market, which means market size, but also their characteristics. And again, the presentation just highlighted some of the results from the study. For more information, please refer to the reports available at this link. And we can, okay, go ahead, Steve, please.
Yeah, a couple add-ons. The PowerPoint is available on our website as well, as is the report. And I did want to ask a question here, Shay, how a lot of the audience is from Florida. You presented predominantly national total data. Tell folks a little bit about how much material on Florida specifically is in the report, if you could.
Yes. Yes, as I mentioned, that the study assessed the transit markets from 5 perspectives: market size, modal share, attitudes, and then social demographics and the trip characteristics. We look at the first 3 perspectives for both U.S. as a whole and Florida. But, we don't have the time and the space to include Florida results in this presentation on the first perspectives, but they are available in the report.
Okay, and again, a lot of the material, we realize it's very dense material. It's really designed to be diagnostic for really the the power user, the professional that really wants to pour into it and understand the market. And so we appreciate your patience in terms of working through some of the graphics, because we realize it is complex data. But that's the level of analysis we need to go into to really start to understand what's going on out there. With that, we'll be glad to take any questions. I don't see any at this point in time, but if folks do have questions, type them in and share them with us. If you have a question, but perhaps not time to communicate it now, feel free to send an email to Dr. Chu. He'd be more than happy to respond to that subsequently. If you've looked over the presentation or the report in more detail, don't hesitate to contact us with subsequent questions.
Steve, there are questions.
Yes, Steve, this is Jennifer. There are a couple of questions. Maybe we have time at least for one. If you click on the Manage tab.
Right.
There you go.
Yes. The first one is in reference to BRT data.
Okay. Yeah. Why was data on BRT and the light rail modes are not separated? Well, because they are not separately identified in the survey, so we couldn't do that. Bus BRT will be part of commuter bus probably, which are included in there.
And a question from Elaine: did you consider using worker non-worker as a person characteristic? And also in slide 18, did you think about separating out New York, New Jersey area since the market's so large?
Yeah, no, worker, non-worker was not separated. Of course, there are many other ways to look at the market, transit markets, and we thought we were mostly focusing on characteristics that have high policy relevance. Most of them related to transportation, disadvantaged populations. But also in terms of congestion relief policy issues, we look at purpose, trip purpose, work included, and then finally, operational transit planning purposes, we look at the frequency of usage, and but in terms of, yes.
Just a comment on the reference to New York, and that's a common question and a common issue, and in some of the analysis we do separate out New York since it is so significant and different in terms of transit supply side in particular, and that's certainly an area where one might choose to separate that out in doing their analysis and certainly understand the importance of it.
Yeah, but one thing, sometimes people may compare some of the results from this study to some of the related items in, the profile report, for example. Those are national total too, so right. In that sense, they are more comparable.
Right, good point. A question from Rich Clarendon: did the attitudinal survey ask if travel time was important to users? Was that among the questions?
Well, not directly, but there was, congestion, highway congestion was one of the 6 issues, so they are, highly related.
Okay, I think that concludes the questions. We apologize for running a few minutes late. We will have an evaluation opportunity here for folks, and in addition, you can see our next forthcoming presentation. We'll have some guests from our partner in the National Center for Transit Research, North Dakota State University. We'll be speaking on April 5th on transit technology and public participation. So if that's an interest of yours, we encourage you to participate in that one. And if you would, we'd appreciate the feedback. We continue to refine and tweak our programs here, so we very much appreciate your participation in the evaluation survey. Thanks very much for your time.